Hello, everybody, and welcome to this UK in a Changing Europe Day 2022 event. I'm Jill Rutter. I'm a Senior Research Fellow at UK in a Changing Europe. So we're here today over the next hour and a quarter to discuss the current state of UK-EU relations. After those local elections, after that result in Northern Ireland, after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which seems to have provoked a lot of new thinking across Europe about security relations, after President Macron's re-election in France, and the day before what is promised to be an Brexit opportunities-rich Queen's speech. Meanwhile, the domestic political agenda across the world is dominated by that hangover from the 1970s and 1980s, which most of my panel is too young to remember, a cost of living crisis. So are the UK and the EU learning to live comfortably together after a painful divorce, realizing they have bigger enemies than each other and lots of common interests, or are they still throwing the teacups at each other? That is what we're going to be discussing. And to do that, I'm joined by a top panel, two professors, Hussein Kassim from the University of East Anglia and Barnard from Trinity College, Cambridge. Hussein is both senior fellows and Catherine is deputy director of UK in a Changing Europe. Two serving civil servants, Olaf Henricson-Bell, EU Director now in the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, and Nicole Mannion, Deputy Head of the EU Mission in the UK, and one very ex-civil servant, former colleague of mine, the UK's former permanent representative in Brussels, Sir Ivan Rogers. A reminder, this is all on the record. Post your questions on Slido, and if you feel the need, use the anonymous button. Upvote those you like, because that means that I will come to those. And do feel free to tweet along. We're going to take this at some pace, so I'm going to kick off with a question to Hussein. Hussein, we've just published two working papers today by you and your collaborator, Cleo Davis, on the machinery of the UK-EU relationship. The withdrawal agreement and the trade and cooperation agreement set out very complex and potentially very time-consuming machinery. But how do you think it's actually working in practice?
Not effectively in some senses, and not so effectively in others. There were two very complex committee systems, as you say. The one on the withdrawal agreement really matters. That's where most of the action has been. There's a joint committee co-chaired by Maros Šefčovič, Vice President of the Commission, and by Liz Truss currently. That's been, I think, far more involved than many people would have anticipated, particularly on the Northern Ireland Protocol. I think this is where the sort of the clashes, the confrontation, but also the negotiation and talking have happened. What I would say, given the topic of the of today's seminar, is really that this is the priority for the EU. The implementation of the Northern Ireland Protocol really matters. This is what, in a way, the EU cannot see beyond. Implementation is really important, and it's very anxious and nervous about what it perceives as the failure of the UK to comply with its obligations there. The trade and cooperation agreement also has a partnership council, several trade partnership committees, and various other committees looking at particular sectors. There doesn't seem to have been as much fireworks there, but I wouldn't say that a lot of those sort of arenas are inactive exactly, but some of them haven't really been activated as yet. And there's lots that the TCA leaves open, lots of it leaves open for negotiation and agreement, and some of those committees haven't yet got round to fulfilling some of the unfinished business that the TCA leaves.
And is there a sense that that's because of the ongoing arguments about the Northern Ireland Protocol? Is there some degree of linkage that some of those committees aren't doing very much because everybody's waiting on progress on Northern Ireland?
I think that's certainly one reason. I don't know what the UK side thinks about this. But certainly on the EU side, I think that there's a sense that actually it's the withdrawal agreement and it's the Northern Ireland Protocol that really matter.
So Ivan, coming on to you, if things had turned out differently, you might be still sitting over in Brussels, helping service some of these agreements. Do you share the sort of assessment from Hussein that actually all the actions on Northern Ireland and relatively little is happening on the other areas?
I mean, if I was still in Brussels, I think I'd be in year 10, so hopefully I'd have escaped by now, come what may. Look, it's the main obstacle to, and it's a formidable obstacle to the improvement, a broader improvement in relations. I mean, the one bright spot, curiously, of course, in the current world, because of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, is that has brought the Western world together more convincingly and more coherently than happened in 2014 when I was there negotiating sanctions at the time of Crimea or the shoot down of MH17. And we shouldn't underestimate that. I think that's important, and that's happening on various nets. And I think the UK is engaged in that. And I think that stuff, which has to be delivered at pace along with the US, and I would say the US is playing a much more systematic and constructive role, including with the EU 27 than it did in 2014, and doing it much more effectively. That's an avenue towards rethinking this relationship a bit more broadly than just narrowly on the protocol and the TCA. But are things blocked essentially because of the protocol and where we are on the protocol and the impasse on that? Of course they are. I think that is blocking what some people refer to as the constructive or positive agenda in Brussels. There isn't much of a positive agenda right across the board. So I think unless you unlock the protocol, it's going to be very difficult to move forward. And personally, I remain very skeptical about this sort of stuff about, some strategic reset and, Macron's second term and a general warm up of relations. I don't think that will translate across from what I hope is intensive and serious cooperation on Russia-Ukraine into other domains, because I simply don't think that's the way the EU works or the world works. So I remain pessimistic short term about any serious improvement in EU-UK relations. I remain long term of the view that the TCA is very far from the last word. There's a lot that is missing. There's a lot that's going to have to be built over the next decade. I'm pretty confident that ultimately it will get built, but I don't think it'll get built under Boris Johnson's administration.
And there were some suggestions that the sort of mood music had changed when the lead responsibility for the withdrawal agreement, the TCA, moved from Lord Frost in the Cabinet Office to Liz Truss, in the sense that as Foreign Secretary, she would take a sort of wider, perhaps more geostrategic view of that relationship. And there was, that early sort of love-in at Chevening with Maroš Šefčovič, her opposite number as EU lead negotiator. Do you get a sense that anything material's changed with the change of responsibility there?
No, not really. I think it had got pretty poisonous with David Frost pre-Christmas. So there was a temporary improvement and clearly a determination on her part to reset the tone of the relationship. And she is at least able to bring herself occasionally to mention the EU in dispatches, albeit in a sort of complex list of other multilateral organizations with which it doesn't fit. So it's not quite the same tone. But has there been some fundamental change of UK stance on the protocol of what needs to happen on the protocol? Not in my view, and not from what I hear from either Commission or Council Secretariat sources. So are we still essentially in the same place as we were 3 or 4 months ago? Regrettably, yes. And I think this is quite a serious crisis. You'll want to come on to this obviously later in the call. I think there's quite a serious crisis coming again this side of the summer. Okay,
I'm going to move on. Nicole, what's it look like from the EU side? I think your boss was on the Today programme this morning, trying to warm things up, maybe for some forward momentum. EU think there's really much prospect of that?
Well, thank you, Jill. And first of all, thank you very much for having me on this panel today on Europe Day, which of course is a very important day for all of us in the European Union and wider Europe as well. To your question, and maybe to respond a little bit to what Ivan has said. My experience the last 18 months or thereabouts that I've been in this role is that the past 3 months since Russia invaded Ukraine, I think have certainly changed many of the dynamics around the relationship between the UK and the EU. because it basically has brought us to work together as part of the kind of wider Western alliance that Ivan has referred to. And I think in many ways it has also reminded both of us of the kind of fundamental values that we share, which is rule of law, respect for democracy, respect for human rights and international humanitarian law. And I think it has also demonstrated how much we need to work together, not just on this, but on other challenges that exist and that are coming our way. That said, and as Ivan has said, I think the fundamental difficulties around the protocol remain. And that goes to the levels of trust between the EU and the UK. And I think the point that Joao, our ambassador, was making this morning was that we should be inspired by what we have achieved in the last few months on Ukraine in terms of the cooperation between us, which has been extensive. We have synchronized on sanctions. We've worked together on humanitarian aid. We've, of course, worked together on all of the very intense diplomatic outreach that has happened in multilateral fora to isolate Russia. And I would say there is almost permanent collaboration and conversation between Brussels and London on the very important subject of Ukraine. But we would hope to see that kind of momentum be brought to the discussions around the protocol. And we are ready to sit down tomorrow and discuss those issues. As I think Ivan referred to, we put a package on the table last October, which we felt went very far in terms of finding the flexibilities within the protocol as it has been agreed. And we very much want to kind of find those joint solutions to the problem. So I'll leave it there.
Okay, Olaf, I've heard what Nicole said, what João Valide Almeida said this morning. You're now part of the Foreign Office, having previously been in the Cabinet Office. Does it give you a different perspective? You know, is Ukraine changing stuff in the way in which you see relations with the EU more widely?
Well, firstly, thanks for organising the panel, and happy Europe Day to everybody. I think Ukraine has changed a lot about how people see the framework for international relations at the moment. You hear a lot of people say geopolitics is back, and looking back on the past 20 to 30 years is the kind of West potentially getting a bit naive in its relations with the rest of the world. And so certainly from that perspective, the cooperation we've had with the EU on whether it be kind of political through the EU's and member state membership of the G7, technical on sanctions and energy, and with in the coordination on the supply of weaponry and humanitarian assistance, I think has been exemplary. And I think we share the same analysis of what's going on in Ukraine and of what the next steps are that we should be doing to deliver that. So I think that is that's all positive and sets the sort of the tone that Nicole has rightly pointed to. I think, you know, I tend to think that people can overthink, both from inside and from outside, the importance of where architecture sits in government. So I wouldn't necessarily put too much weight on that. What I would say is that in that kind of geopolitical crisis, having all of the bits of the relationship together, I think is a helpful context to bring, because it means you can have the rounded conversation. I think that's what the Foreign Secretary's been doing since January. And I think I'm probably overall a bit more optimistic about kind of where we've got to over the past kind of year and a half since the TTA came into force, because I think we always knew that a change as significant as this was going to bring some challenges, both kind of practical, but also frankly kind of emotional and psychological for everyone involved. And I think, you know, lots of the things we were trying to avoid or trying to succeed in creating across that period have happened. So, you know, we haven't seen the challenges that some people forecast that at the border. We have seen trade continue under the terms of the TCA, albeit with changes. I'll talk about those later. And we have seen that the institutions that Hussein talked about under the TCA have all now met, so all of the specialised committees and the Partnership Council and so on. And just this week, I think our parliamentarians are heading out to Brussels to take part in the Parliamentary Partnership Assembly, which is another one of the institutions established under the TCA. So there's a lot of dialogue going on, and yes, it is different from when you were inside the EU because we've left the institution, and therefore the level of contact and the type of contact is different. But I think everyone's getting used to that, and that was always going to take time, and it is starting to flow through.
Go ahead.
Go on. No, Jill, I was going to turn to Northern Ireland, but I'm sure we're going to spend a lot of time on that. So
I was just going to ask you, before we get to Northern Ireland, we've got all these committees to oversee the operation of the TCA. And there was quite an interesting speech by Lord Frost a few weeks ago as the architect of the TCA, where he suggested there were some areas that the UK government perhaps got slightly wrong. And he singled out mobility, which has been a big area of concern for a lot of people that is having unintended effects. I just wondered whether the UK government, before we get onto Northern Ireland, had a sort of positive agenda that it was developing of areas where it thought it might want to use the TCA machinery to improve the working of the TCA or deepen cooperation or remove some impediments that have emerged perhaps unexpectedly as the TCA has been implemented.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, these things kind of vary widely in the kind of individual significance of them. But if you think about it, just in the first year, there have been areas that have been identified, some areas where we've made progress either inside the TCA or outside. So aerospace would be an example of that outside of the TCA. And areas inside the TCA where there are things that we think need to be improved that have been identified across that period are really what sounds technical, but it's very important, I promise you, for smaller businesses. The VAT threshold under which companies can register to export as the EU rules have changed, and adapting the TCA to match that threshold, I think is a really important area where we would be pushing for a step forward. And there are bits, but it's also the case that after, understandably after a year and a half, both sides, I think, are rightly focused on implementing what we agreed. And there are bits of that where we still would like to see more progress. So whether it be around electricity trading, where there was a commitment to move to a new system by April, i.e. last week, and where we haven't yet been able to get there. There are some signs that's moving, but we'd like to see that put in place. And I think we've seen the value of energy cooperation through this crisis. Or another example would be on EU programs, where we agreed that the UK would associate to Horizon and other programs as soon as possible, and that's been held up by a linkage drawn with Northern Ireland Protocol, which we consider not justified by the legal framework. So we'd like to see progress on those, but yes, obviously, where other things come up, then we would pursue them.
That's very interesting. Some of those are a bit below the radar, though. I saw Catherine nodding very affirmatively over the change in the VAT threshold. So clearly took that up as a big bit of progress. So coming on, you want to get into Northern Ireland and where things stand on Northern Ireland.
Sure. So I mean, we've had the elections, and I think everyone's focus is on seeing an executive reformed and the Secretary of State's meeting all of the parties today. Our concern is obviously that the way the protocol has been implemented and the nature of some of the strains it places upon the framework in Northern Ireland and the Belfast Good Friday Agreement means that the sort of balance of that agreement is now is being threatened. That's important in and of its own terms, and we're obviously a co-guarantor of that agreement, and that's sort of the fundamental basis for how Northern Ireland is governed. And the positive thing is that everyone accepts those problems with the protocol now, which is a considerable change, both between us and the EU, but also all of the parties in Northern Ireland essentially accept that there are problems with the protocol. And I say that because a lot of the coverage has been sort of, framed as, UK wants to scrap protocol and EU wants to keep protocol. But that isn't the debate that I've seen anyone having inside the system. No one argues that there shouldn't be a protocol and that we don't need systems to protect North-South, the open border between Ireland and Northern Ireland. But everyone does accept that the operation of the protocol hasn't done what we wanted. You know, the EU has recently taken through its legal measures on access to medicines in Northern Ireland. Now, I don't think the EU meant that its protocol would prevent medicines being, nor did we when we signed it, getting from the GB to Northern Ireland, and it's right to recognise that needs changing. And our preference would be a negotiated solution to that. But we have always been clear that if we can't do that, then that the protection of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement is the kind of the priority. And now this is urgent, because obviously because of the need to form an executive, and therefore, as I think ministers said yesterday and on the news this morning, we would have to take measures if no alternatives were available. But you know, our preference would be a negotiated approach. And the bottom line is, if you want to see it from our perspective, is we've got a situation now where you've got a standstill operating in Northern Ireland, and that's the basis of the experience of people in Northern Ireland when they're judging the protocol, and they say there needs to be changes. And yet, I think the EU did put some really good proposals and did a lot of work, and I think Vice President Šefčovič did a lot of work inside the college to get proposals last October. But the bottom line is that those proposals would take us back from where we are today. You know, they would involve more friction between Great Britain and Northern Ireland than we see in practice today. And it's hard, therefore, if that is the limit of the EU's flexibility, to see how that could be part of putting the executive back together. That's why we need to look at other options. So I'll leave it there, Jill, because I've gone on a bit.
Right.
I'm sure we'll come back to it.
In terms of where we are, we're obviously in these grace periods where everybody's effectively accepted that the UK is extending these grace periods. Is that now where you want to land, that those grace periods are just sort of enshrined in the long-term agreement and become the way we do things? Or does the UK want to go beyond those grace periods? Because obviously last summer we saw things like removing the ECJ, changing the rules on state aids and things as well. Are those still in play?
Yeah. I think the kind of, you know, as we would want this to be done through in a negotiated way, and therefore obviously there's going to be give and take on both sides. And I think there are kind of nuance to all of those issues, aren't there, including on the kind of governance point you raised just now, Jill. But I think the bottom line is that we need a set of solutions that is kind of proportionate to the task, and also that ensures that the operation of the protocol and the arrangements we have is kind of balanced north-south and east-west. So we would want, for example, goods that are going clearly to Northern Ireland not to be subject to the same level of checks as those going to the south. We would like, for example, people who order things from Amazon in Northern Ireland to be able to receive those parcels without a load of paperwork. We would like people to be able to take their pets with them when they travel within their country without having to fill in certificates and get additional injections. So, you know, those are real things that make a difference. And I know it can sound a bit sort of esoteric, but as other people on this panel know much better than me, looking across them, this isn't just about kind of the rules of trade. It's fundamentally about sort of identity, people's need for a sense of security in that identity. And I think actually everyone agrees on that. I think, you know, we, the Irish government and the EU all agree on that. But what we do need to see is solutions that are going to actually improve those problems. And yes, that does mean that we think the EU needs to go further than the proposals from October for the reasons that I outlined.
I'm going to come to Catherine. Don't worry, Catherine, but I just wanted to flick back to Nicole very quickly about pets. Amazon. Maroš Šefčovič was very interesting when he presented his proposals. He listened very much to the concerns of businesses in Northern Ireland. That was one of his big selling points, but he did seem to ignore a lot of those things that concern just normal people wanting to take Fido between Scotland and Northern Ireland on the ferry. I mean, you know, surely the EU is going to be open to some of those very light touch, pretty trivial ameliorations.
Well, I think maybe just to respond to some of the points there that Olaf has raised. I mean, I think it's important to be clear when we talk about the Good Friday Agreement that the whole purpose of the protocol from the very beginning, and the whole purpose of the negotiations around the protocol, is everyone on this panel who are, I think, as we can describe them, Brexit lifers at this point, will remember, was to protect the Good Friday Agreement from the challenges posed by the kind of Brexit chosen by the British government. So that has always been our motivation in terms of getting to that agreement, and in terms of finding solutions to some of the difficulties around the implementation. And I think in terms of what what kind of measures you could see to solve that, I would stress that they have to be joint solutions, and they have to be solutions that are found within the protocol. They are not things that the protocol is not something that is going to be renegotiated or indeed torn up entirely. It's the only solution that any of us have found over these many, many years of discussing many different models, as you will recall, Jill, of what might work. And we're very willing to do that. As I said, we did put something on the table last October. It went very far in terms of flexibilities. And I think what we need now is to sit down and have a serious conversation about how those flexibilities could work. And I think in terms of, in terms of kind of what might happen over the next few days, I think the message from us would be very much that unilateral measures is not something I think that would help this conversation. I think it would not help in terms of finding a solution. And I think, unfortunately, it would also, I think, set back some of the positive elements of the relationship that we have rebuilt as a result of our cooperation on Ukraine. So I think our message very much is let's resume these discussions, and let's find a way to go forward within the protocol. And I will say as well, as my last point, Jill, we have spent a lot of time listening to everyone in Northern Ireland. The Vice President went to Northern Ireland last September. We've travelled ourselves from the delegation frequently. We listened to all of business, civil society, all of the political actors in Northern Ireland. And all of our proposals have been put together on that basis, on the basis of all the problems and the concerns that have been raised with us. So we do want to address these issues, and we do want to talk to the UK about it. So let's get on and do it, would be my message.
Okay, well, that's, I suppose, positive, but I'm going to come on to the negative and bring in my colleague, Catherine. We were told in various briefings over the past couple of weeks that the government might consider bringing forward legislation tomorrow in the Queen's speech to disapply parts of the protocol. Now looks as though that legislation isn't going to happen, but we're told by Dominic Raab yesterday that everything is still on the table. So Kassim, what are the sort of UK's options, and what happens next if the UK does decide to come in and disapply parts of the protocol? Can it rely on the EU to turn a blind eye, as it has done to unilateral extensions of grace periods so far? Catherine, you're muted.
Thanks. Yes, it's tricky, isn't it? Because if there is UK legislation, what form will it take? Most likely it will take powers rather than actually we are hereby disapplying the protocol. And most likely it would look something like those contentious clauses in the UK Internal Market Bill back in 2020, but those powers were dropped. We heard Lord Frost say in his speech recently that he regretted dropping those powers because he thinks they would have been good to have kept them on the statute book. So if the powers are going to be used, then the question, if the powers exist, that's one thing. The question is, will they be used? And if they exist, will that in itself be sufficient to trigger a response on the part of the EU? And what the EU could do is to say just the existence of the powers would be a breach of the good faith provisions in the withdrawal agreement. That's Article 5. And that could give grounds for starting the dispute resolution mechanism in the withdrawal agreement. And the dispute resolution mechanism essentially has three elements. There's a political stage, and then a more legal arbitration stage, and then there's the remedies stage. Now, if the UK were to go much further, and I think at the moment that's less likely for the reasons that we've heard, but if the UK were to go much further and say, right, we're going to turn off parts of the protocol, or perhaps trigger Article 16, but not in the way that Article 16 was intended. Again, this seems less likely now. The talk about Article 16 has died down quite significantly. Then that would give the EU the possibility to start the procedure under the Northern Ireland Protocol itself, which would eventually end up before the Court of Justice. The other possibility is that the EU, if it decides to play hardball, has a whole range of tools at its disposal built into the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. You'll remember the Trade and Cooperation Agreement is the future trade deal. It's separate from the withdrawal agreement, but there is a link between them. And there's a range of possibilities there. None, of course, are tested. But at the most basic, what the EU could do, which doesn't require any of these mechanisms to be engaged, is simply to say, actually, we're going to do much more rigorous checks at Calais. We're going to delay, we'll insist on a 24-hour window for looking at the traces documents rather than the 4-hour window at the moment. And of course, that really would gum things up quite messily at Dover. So there is a range of possibilities that's open to the EU. Will the EU turn a blind eye? Well, of course, the positive story would be to say they recognise this is very sensitive, and the situation in Northern Ireland is very sensitive at the moment, particularly with the DUP's position following the elections. On the other hand, of course, the EU is taking a pretty tough line with Hungary, and it would be odd to see it being more generous to a non-member state, albeit in the sensitive context of Northern Ireland, than to a member state.
I mean, there's a question from John Newham, Catherine, about could it actually cause the whole TCA to, I think that's what he means, the whole agreement reached in 2019, well, that's technically the withdrawal agreement. Could it cause the whole thing to collapse, the whole structures, TCA, WA, together to collapse?
I think not least because built into the withdrawal agreement are protections for citizens' rights, which include, of course, the 5 billion or so EU nationals in the UK and the 1 million or so UK nationals in the EU. It is at least theoretically possible for the EU to give 12 months notice and terminate the TCA. But that really would be pretty big guns for dealing with this as a problem. It may be that they could go down a slightly less dramatic route, go down the route of Article 521, which would allow terminating the trade path of the agreement. But again, this is pretty incendiary stuff for dealing with what is a deeply sensitive problem. Don't forget, however, that the TCA itself is up for review in 5 years' time, so 2026. So the process of review would have to start in 2025. And certainly some Brexiteers would say, actually, the review process is a time to take the advantage of the possibility to walk away from the TCA, which of course we could do by giving 12 months notice under, for those who want, it's Article 779 of the TCA.
And I think Lord Frost actually was suggesting that there was a case for a very thorough look at the TCA. Okay, this question isn't going to go to Nicole or Olaf. I'm going to go to Ivan first, Hussein, if you want to have a go, do. Ivan, you're the master of shabby deals in dark corridors that everybody can just about present as a success. So where's the landing zone on the NI protocol? If you were a Canadian who was tasked with finding a way through, what does the final sustainable settlement look like, or is there just not one? And you'll need to be unmuted because we need to hear this. Ivan, you're still muted.
Thanks for throwing me the easy questions. Yes, master of certain types of shabby deals, mostly when we were in the EU, which is slightly easier to do when you're out than when you're outside it, I think. Look, I mean, Olaf puts it very well, as you would expect, and so does Nicole. I've spent a lot of time, too much of my life over recent years, trying to think about the options and where one could land, and indeed whether there is a landing zone compatible with the kind of incentives on both sides. I haven't got a load more optimistic, listening very carefully to people over the last few weeks and months, because they are rather talking past each other. And let's be clear, there is a kind of fundamental question of political trust and faith, and a view of bad faith, probably on both sides, certainly the EU view of the UK's negotiating position and the command paper. And basically the perception at the moment, I think, is that the UK intends in one fashion or another to sort of legislate and establish facts on the ground, knowing full well that that isn't an agreed version of the protocol, but trusting that the EU either won't be able to get, full universal support for severe sanctions, or won't try to because of the Ukraine-Russia context. I think that both of those are misreadings. But I think the difficulty with that is, if that is your fundamental reading, and I do think that's their fundamental reading, what they need to know, if they're to extend even beyond the October package, is the UK in good faith negotiating to a conclusion such that some agreed version of the protocol can be put into force? Because the risk for them is you try and do more within the framework of the protocol without reopening the text. Because Maros Sefcovic is not going to get a new mandate from the council, and he isn't going to try. So some of the stuff that you hear from UK ministers about, he needs a new mandate, he's tried his best, but the council has to reopen the mandate. Well, it's not going to happen. He won't get a new mandate, but there is scope within the mandate to do quite a bit, I think. I hope I'm not deluding myself there about the degree of flexibility on the other side, or degree of potential flexibility on the other side, because I think it's, quite severely constrained. And I'm not sure the British side has always fully understood the limits of those constraints. But the exam question, therefore, for the EU, if it wants to bend every effort in the next few weeks, listening to what it's going to get from the Unionist side, in particular in Northern Ireland and the British government, is, do we invest in this heavily? Well, you only do so if you're absolutely sure that the other side ultimately, if you could get there, would sign off on it, sign on the dotted line, and not behave in the way that David Frost's speech outlined. Because if they're going to behave in that way anyway, all they will do is pocket any concessions and still blow the thing up in 2024. So you don't give them, any negotiator would tell you, well, in those circumstances, you don't give them concessions. Nor would I, sitting in their seat. I think, well, if that's the game they're playing, just, squeeze, legislate domestically, see what they can get out of us, but then, having pocketed what they can get out of us, blow it up anyway. Fine, you can play that game, but we're not playing, would be my response. And I think that's where we are. And I don't think we can pussyfoot around this in a kind of technical negotiation, because these are, look, on the outside, you can't possibly know what's going on in the room on both sides, or possibly know the level of detail of the negotiators on both sides, having done these kind of negotiations. So by definition, I don't know, none of us can know on the outside exactly what could be done on every technicality to try and resolve every issue. What would I try and do? Well, the trouble is, in all honesty, Jill, I think we're beyond the point at which one could do it. And I'm afraid one is bedeviled by the history and the distrust of the last few years. The only way you ever get anywhere in these processes is, in my view, is smoke-filled rooms, utterly secret processes, going into the so-called tunnel, nothing leaks. And then people like Olaf and others, very few of them on both sides, closet themselves with each other and explore what might be the art of the possible, which goes a bit beyond their negotiating mandates on both sides. And that process has to be extremely covert, extremely quiet, no leaks, nothing on the front page of the Daily Telegraph or its Brussels equivalent. And you have to have political cover to do that, because there has to be obvious determination from the political level to do it and say, we really want a resolution by date X, and we need you guys to go off and flush out now exactly what could be done, the maximum possible on both sides. The trouble is, we're not there, and I don't think that's what the UK government is in the process of doing in the next few weeks. I mean, I hope I'm wrong. I hope you could still set up a process which, between now and the autumn, tried to deliver that. But in all honesty, I look at this from the outside and I think, is that what's about to happen? I don't think so.
Okay, well, I think that I've instructed Ivan before we started the session to be constructive and non-gloomy.
I think it could be done, but I just don't think it will be done.
Okay, well, that's, I suppose, positive. I'm going to change tack slightly because I think that's probably enough Northern Ireland, though we can come back to it. The top ranked question, Hussein, is from Anonymous, who asks, how much longer can Labour studiously avoid talking about the consequences of Brexit? And when will it come up with specific ways toward closer links to the EU? I'm going to change that question slightly to being not about timing, but if you were David Lammy, whoever is in charge of sort of Brexit there, as Liz Truss's opposite number, where would you be looking to improve the TCA if you were fighting the next election and were prepared to mention Brexit at all? What would be on your agenda?
Well, I think mobility is a sort of great place to start, but there are lots of other sort of functional changes that have been introduced that just create all kinds of disadvantages. I mean, back to pets. I mean, we travelled with pets recently to France, and it was a total nightmare now. So I would look at all of those things which make life better for everybody, and I would start there. So this is a version of bits of Brexit, making Brexit work. What everyone thinks of that slogan, but it's identifying a set of very specific issues and questions that can be addressed, and that perhaps there's willingness on both sides to look at, to resolve. And there must have been there are many things from what I understand that were sort of left on the cutting room table, if I could put it that way, that both sides might be prepared to resurrect a bit or sort of work upon.
Catherine, do you have anything you would add to the shopping list for Labour?
I would just build on the mobility theme, which we already know is an area where Lord Frost has said he didn't get what he hoped for. At a minimum, a youth mobility scheme, which you find in a number of free trade agreements. The fact is that youngsters can't go and work in bars in Spain and vice versa. So to have at least 2 years for where the under 35s can go without having to go through a laborious work permit and visa process. At the moment, Spanish national can't come and work in the UK to work in a bar. There is no obvious visa route. And then in respect of services provisions, at the moment, the detail about how you provide a service is fiendishly complicated. Now, musicians and other performers have already discovered that to their costs, but it's not just them. And I think it's a matter of regret that actually what the Commission had proposed, which is essentially paid work is allowed for up to 90 days out of 180, would have been, as a service provider, would have actually helped a very large number of fairly normal business exchanges. The problem is, at the moment, yes, you can do some work as a service provider, but you really have to take a copy of your TCA with you to work out which bit of the annex you are operating under. And as I've experienced myself, trying to engage with a Polish immigration officer at 4 a.m. to try and discuss exactly which bit of the TCA I was operating under is not a place where you actually want to be. And so all of this makes life really very much more complicated.
Nicole, is there any appetite for any of that on the EU side? Because obviously it takes two to bother to negotiate, and maybe the EU just likes making it really difficult for UK creative performers and professionals to do. But are there any areas where the EU is actually looking for change with a different government?
Well, look, I think point of mobility, that was one of the elements in the original negotiation, and we did have an offer on the table which was rejected by the UK, unfortunately. So that is the history of that. I think on the TCA, I mean, it's always meant to be a living document. It's always, it has a number of review clauses in various different areas and so on. I mean, it brings me back, really, this question brings me back to the whole question of trust. I think, what people and officials and our political masters in Brussels need to see is that the UK can honour the legal commitments it has already entered into. Before we go down the road of discussing further cooperation and further agreements, they need to see that assurance and they need to see that kind of good faith before we start investing effort in coming up with new agreements. So, I mean, it just goes to my original point. We want to build a stable and positive relationship with the UK. We need to, frankly. There's a lot of challenges coming our way, but we need to resolve the issues around the protocol first, so that we can see that we can move forward on that basis with the UK.
So, Ivan, do you see any prospect that Labour, to quote Anonymous, will come off the Brexit fence? When you're talking around, do you get a sense of any appetite there to start talking about Brexit finally? Ivan?
No, in all candour, and I don't think they will politically. That doesn't mean to say that they aren't thinking about what could be done to revise the TCA or improve the TCA in domains they care about, and we could cover their asylum and returns policy or defence policy or mobility or plenty of other things. So I would think they'll be thinking about it, but they're not going to go back into the single market or the customs union, and they will be specific about ruling that out. And let's be honest with ourselves, because we haven't been honest with ourselves for the last 6 years, and there's no danger of that honesty breaking out in British politics now. Leaving the single market, which I always thought we would do, both for free movement reasons on the mobility question and for rule-taking reasons on the financial services question, does make services liberalisation across border extremely difficult. So while I'm with Catherine in principle about the extraordinary difficulties of what you face as a services provider across borders, even in understand, let's not kid ourselves. When you're outside a single market, you may well be in tortuous, difficult, single state by member state by member state negotiations on specific things in order to reduce the volume of carve-outs and exceptions they take against your services. That's the reason not to leave the single market. Now, as I say, I don't, we've left the single market. We aren't going back in under whichever government. We're still having great difficulty in fathoming the real difficulties of living outside a single market. And I'm afraid Lord Frost and many of his other colleagues were completely obsessed with tariffs and tariff rate quotas. And that's all very interesting, but it's not the big impediment. It's the non-tariff barriers and the barriers to services trade that are a much bigger problem. And the reason why you're seeing a GDP hit for the UK is primarily on services, not on goods, although there's significant problems on goods. So, look, I think there is an agenda that you could build if you were Labour and wanted to think, but you'd have to think micro and bottom up, and you'd have to think area by area. Are there things that we could do some political trading on? Recognising if you went forward, for example, with Catherine's youth mobility package, the other side isn't just going to sit there and say, well, that's absolutely fine, let's just negotiate on the terrain you want. It will put its own demands on the table, which Priti Patel, for example, would go berserk about. So there isn't a cat in hell's chance of any of this happening under Boris Johnson's government.
Okay, I'm going to move on from Labour back to the government. Tomorrow's Queen's speech. I'm going to go on to the wider international picture, but this is my last domestic stuff. Hussein, you've seen various bills being trailed by the government. Are there any that you think are potential flashpoints that are going to make the operation of all that machinery you've written on more difficult? Data, is that going to be an issue? Is there anything else?
I actually think data is the sort of crucial issue. Yes, I think that is the one.
And why is that problematic? Why is that potentially problematic? Does it matter what the government does there?
It really doesn't matter what the government does there, and it matters because of the sort of data equivalence and how difficult that was to achieve. And I think the EU will be will be extremely sensitive to this.
Catherine, does something on human rights matter? We've got a human rights bill trailed.
It sure does. It depends what exactly goes into it. And on the human rights issue, clearly, if we knock the stuffing out of the European Convention on Human Rights and our obligations under it, that throws into question our commitments under particularly the law enforcement aspect of the TCA. I don't think the bill will go that far, but if the bill goes as far as it's been trailed, which is to say that UK courts don't need to follow decisions of the European Court of Human Rights, that is already a serious problem, because it shows serious non-commitment to our obligations under that particular treaty. And it is worth bearing in mind that these are treaty obligations as well. Just on the other issue that I will be looking out for, because not only am I a Brexit lifer, but I'm also a nerd. and that's what's going to happen to retained EU law. Now, we've heard big promises here from the UK government, but what is exactly going to happen to that?
That's likely to come when we see tomorrow. We'll just get the promise of action, won't we? Rather than it'll be in the substance that comes through. Ivan, you wanted to come in.
Yeah, if I may, just briefly on the data point. I think data is very interesting anyway, and you are seeing real movement between EU and US. Again, if I look at this from the outside and compare what's going on between the EU and UK and what's going on between the EU and US, I see much more substance and depth in the Trade and Technology Council with the US than I see in the TCA machinery with the EU. Now, look on data, when the US Treasury Secretary talks about the need for, Western world data harmonization, harmonization on data privacy, that's quite a big statement. Now, I'll believe it when I see it. And I've lived through EU-US data wars, which bedevil quite a lot of my time in Brussels and before. But they are talking that language. And when she's talking, for example, in this ghastly kind of US neologism, friendshoring, but you're talking about a world of trade where the Western world is much more concerted. It's well worth reading Janet Yellen's speech of April. If any of this is to have meaning, in other words, we're increasing the resilience of our supply chains and improving our own national security and resilience by primarily securing supply chains on both goods and services with our allies. Does any of this apply to the UK and the EU? Because the US is starting to talk this language about a radically different world in terms of multilateral trade and regional trade. Now, as I say, doing that, given the experience that some of us had with TTIP, under the previous administration is quite another matter, but you are seeing much more dynamism in the EU and US Trade and Technology Council. So, for example, look, one final example, 5G, massive Western failure. Why have we ended up with Huawei and the Chinese problem? Because in the end, the only serious 5G provider was Huawei. The Western world collectively failed to have an alternative to that. Is the UK seriously saying it's going to provide its own alternative to that? No, clearly not. If we're going to do very differently on 6G, then 6G is going to have to be a US, EU, and one would hope UK discussion. And this is where I find the narrowness of quite a lot of the TCA and the Frostian preoccupation so worried. AI, data, 6G, those issues are going to have to be discussed and should be being discussed between UK and EU authorities in the way that they are starting to be discussed between US and EU authorities. So again, a different government, we will have to get there. And frankly, you can do that in a way which doesn't in any way infringe on your sovereignty. It's not a matter of forcing the UK to do anything which it doesn't feel it wants to do. But it would have to do it in, illegal forms and legal texts, in legal treaties, and it would have to abide by those treaties, which is why it's not a very good idea to send the signal that you don't intend to.
Olaf.
Thanks. I just thought I wanted to pick up on the reference to Janet Yellen's speech, and I agree. I think friendshoring is like I think it's a bad thing that happens when you're a kid or something. I don't know, but the point she was trying to make, I think, is quite important, and I think it's one we would agree with. And I think it was sort of true and very obvious for years, but I think this crisis has been, in part in the way that Nicole outlined at the start, has been a wake-up call for lots of people about the need for essentially the West to act as a more united actor. And I think we have seen that in sort of foreign policy terms. So, if I think back to the previous crises that I've seen as a diplomat, this has been the one that has seen the best coordination, coordination on communications, coordination on action, and I think that's worked. And I think people have been a bit surprised. They've been a bit surprised that hasn't the Russian kind of propaganda and tweet machine kind of destroyed us. Hasn't the same thing with the Russian army, same thing with some bits of the economic side of things. But to focus on the economic side of things, there's another lesson there, which is that in a way the G7 are sort of operated as the convening function there, and we don't have a sort of economic version of NATO.
Exactly.
Now, whether NATO is the right analogy, but it makes the point, I think, because I think people have. So I think everyone agrees exactly with the sort of the need there, and yes, it's media about Russia, but it's not just about Russia. It's about China and other bits of our foreseeable future. But I just make 2 points about the sort of architecture point there that Ivan was bringing up. The first is, I think in the UK, a lot of, because Brexit has dominated so much of our politics, we tend to think, the moving parts must be in the UK-EU relationship. And maybe they are on some of those issues. And I think some of the points that Catherine made about areas we could go further, we would be totally up for discussing. But the whole point of the challenge here is that it's not just about the UK and the EU. It's about the UK, EU, the US, the rest of the G7, some of the other democracies, including in Asia, if you want this to be kind of credible. And that means that the legal frame, to come back to the technical side of it, the legal frame that you apply to it needs to be different and a bit more flexible, because they aren't in the same way as the way that the EU and the US conversations have been in the past and become hard for the reasons that Ivan demonstrated, because there's a more rigid straitjacket there, and we're going to need something more flexible if we want to be able to deal with that as a kind of wider West. But that is absolutely the conversation that we should be having.
So, Olaf, has this confirmed the UK's view that we were right to reject formal structures in the trade and cooperation agreement about foreign and security cooperation, or has it made the UK think actually this is a much more important dimension to the relationship than we had anticipated back in the good old days of 2020, when we didn't think we were facing this imminent Russian threat? I just wondered whether you were reconsidering internally.
Sure. I think your experience of 2020 sounds quite different from mine, Jill, if that's the good old days. But anyway, yeah, I know, but there were some other problems from memory. I think this has always been sort of overthought, if you see what I mean. I think and again, maybe I'm just not what you call in EU kind of academic parlance. I'm not really a functionalist. We can go around the kind of the structures. That's a niche gag for about 0.2% of your audience there. There's an argument for those. In the case of what happened in the year the TCA was negotiated, we had a ticking clock, and so stripping bits out that enabled the negotiation to be focused and to get to a conclusion, as you'll recall, on Christmas Eve, because I remember having to kind of do some work that I wasn't looking forward to doing on Christmas Eve. They were stripping stuff off the bark, as it were. I don't think there's a kind of ideological opposition to further cooperation. But what I would say is that this crisis has shown that it is happening. And it already was. It's just that it wasn't always visible. So we were, for example, talking to the EU about how we would work together on sanctions coming into the second half of last year. That work has been what's enabled us to be so coordinated when the Russia crisis has kicked off. And I spent a decent chunk of my time and my team's time on exactly that question of foreign policy and other sorts of cooperation. And yes, I'm sure we will have further conversations both with the EU and with the member states, and obviously through NATO as we head to the Madrid summit, on what the Euro-Atlantic security architecture looks like after this crisis. And it needs some changes, including, I think we'll come to it in a minute, but in terms of how, and this goes to exactly the same point on Western coordination. How do you have a Euro-Atlantic defense and industry in a world where you have kind of competing blocks of regulatory and other challenges that are opposed to that industry? Now, there aren't easy solutions to that, but you would, to be more efficient and to be more structured, both as economic and defense actors, that's what you would need.
Ivan, you want to come in quickly, then I want to go to Nicole. Ivan.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to come in as an architecture and institutions bore, but I mean, we're basically agreeing, I think, that at the moment there isn't a sort of institutional forum or set of fora in which this works very well. So I agree with Olaf that the bulk of these discussions go obviously much wider than EU and UK if you're talking about Western world coordination. but you can't really do it within the WTO for obvious reasons. And it's not clear that the WTO is in a great state of health or will survive the next few years. You can't do it in multilateral fora where you're blocked. The G7 has no secretariat and architecture. So I saw what Liz Truss had to say about, essentially kind of trios of presidencies derived from an EU model, really. But the G7 has always been fireside chat, very light, no architecture, no institutional follow-up, no mechanisms, and for good reason, because that's what leaders inside the G7 wanted. G20 is basically, let's not be too unkind about it, but basically blown up at the moment as an instrument for doing anything globally for very obvious reasons in terms of its membership. So there is a deficit here. And the problem is, yes, some of it's EU specific, quite a lot of it isn't EU specific, but there's nothing on the economic, regulatory and trade side which enables us to have the requisite conversations. Now, it's interesting that the EU and US, having reflected on what went wrong on the TTIP experience, and I've been through the kind of TTIP experience many times in 25 years on EU-US, has reflected on institutions and architecture. And I think it's right to have reflected on it. I think the EU and the UK are going to have to reflect on it. It's easier for the UK to do things in a G7 format because the Japanese and Canadians are there and you don't call it EU. But you still have to have a set of fora in which this conversation can happen on multiple kind of regulatory fronts where there's been an allergy in London to even having the conversation with the EU in the room. Now, I think this is soluble in a way which makes the UK relax that it doesn't impinge on its sovereignty. But I'm afraid you are going to have to think about institutional architecture and mechanisms. It's a global governance question, I think.
Nicole, I just wanted to come in with a perspective from the EU, because to some of us sitting in London, it seems as though one of the sort of Brexit dividends for the EU has been that the EU has been able to be much bolder and more ambitious, whether it was on the COVID pandemic response, whether it was on a greater role on defence security cooperation, things like that, than would have been ever possible with the UK, Ivan's successor +2 or whatever, in the room, sucking teeth and saying the UK didn't like that and didn't want that, didn't think it was an appropriate role for the EU. So, is there a sense within the EU that actually it's now a sort of stronger, more confident actor across the piece and developing ways that it wouldn't have done without the UK? And that might lead it actually to then think again, as Ivan suggested, about the ways in which it has a different sort of conversation with a sovereign UK outside the room.
Yeah, well, maybe just to the previous point about the lack of a structured cooperation on foreign and security policy. I mean, I take Olaf's point that this was one of the things stripped out at the last minute, along with many other elements in the negotiations. But I think the signal it sent very much was that the UK did not want a close relationship with the EU, which I think was unfortunate, because I think we see now, to Ivan's point, that we need channels to discuss these various pressing issues that face us. And certainly, and as I said before, and I certainly agree with Olaf, I mean, the cooperation on Ukraine has been excellent. We're working very well together and it's been very necessary. But I think ad hoc kind of cooperation in the future is not the way forward. We will need a more sustainable way to kind of discuss these issues on a regular basis. So not to be an institutions board either, or an architecture board, but I think that's something worth reflecting on. Question, Jill, about are things easier without the UK? Look, I think there's sometimes a sense here that people in Brussels are sitting around, thinking we're so glad they're gone. We can get everything done, et cetera, and that is not the case. I think there is still very much a sense of regret that this has happened. Very much a sense that we are partners in Europe. The UK is not in the EU anymore, but I think as I think the Prime Minister was fond of saying when he was Foreign Secretary, the UK is still in Europe. And we really do need to work together. And our main concern is to find ways to do that so that we can be effective in guaranteeing our own security and our own interests. I mean, I don't think necessarily things have gotten easier inside the EU. We face our own challenges, but I think we do need to consider how we work together going forward.
Hussein, do you think the EU's changed with the UK gone?
I mean, I think there's certain decisions, and we were saying earlier about about what it would have been like with the Conference of Europe on the future of Europe if the UK had been inside. I think that's one can only imagine what the coverage would have been like, what the pressures on government would have been like. But I do think there are very important developments that have taken place that it's very hard to imagine would have taken place with the UK president. I'm thinking principally in the response to the COVID crisis and the development of the next gen EU and the Recovery and Resilience Fund. I can't see that ever being adopted with the UK present. But I agree with, Nicole. I've spent over the last 6 years, I've spent so much time in Brussels speaking to people in the Commission and Council Secretariat and across sort of diplomatic services of various member states, and we just found that there is that regret, there is this disappointment, and just this hope that we'll get better at some point. So there's certainly no sort of celebratory movement, no sense of sort of relief they've gone. I don't think that's. I've seen no evidence for that at all. In fact, there's respect for the tradition, the history, for British culture. That's what I find everywhere.
So is there a sense beyond Ukraine and the immediate threat of areas where actually there could be productive forward cooperation, maybe UK, EU, or maybe, as Ivan was suggesting, sort of UK, EU, US sort of coming together? Hussein?
Perhaps I don't speak to the right people. I don't get a sense of this kind of sort of grand envisioning. I mean, it's a similar question to I think the one you just asked earlier about on the EU side, thinking about what we call in academic circles external differentiation. And we all think that it would be a great idea for the EU to do this, but I'm not so sure that there's a lot of thinking on the EU side about moving in that direction. I'm not sure there is that strategic thinking. But I may be wrong about that. I don't know what. Be interesting to hear what Nicole thinks.
Ivan, do you think there's strategic thinking going on in the EU? Maybe it's strategic thinking about how it has to relate to its wider non-EU member neighbourhood, Georgia, Moldova, Ukraine, with the prospect of membership.
A bit, but it's obviously very, having been involved in too many of those discussions over about the last 20 years on kind of association agreements versus accession processes, whatever, and wholly predictable divisions within the council as to where to go and with whom, it's a very difficult conversation to have any novelties about. I think Monsieur Macron is about to say something quite strategic and systematic about it, and I think it's quite interesting. I do think there would have been a more interesting conversation had Monsieur Macron been in office for longer, overlapping longer with David Cameron, because some of what he's saying about a Europe essentially of different destinations, some of this, of course, is allied to rather long-standing French positions about the scale and nature and pace of enlargement and its consequences. Some of it's related to the Ukraine crisis. But in terms of where we thought we were trying to get in 2016, it was a Europe of different destinations rather than different speeds, where it wasn't essential for everybody to join every element of every club. And we never had any intention of either joining a common asylum policy or a common monetary policy or Schengen or plenty else. Now, that boat has sailed, but are we going to get back in the context of the Ukraine crisis to what is there between full membership with the destiny of joining the euro and sort of bog standard trade agreements and association agreements? Yeah, I do think that discussion is coming, and I think Macron's about to start it. And I think that's healthy, because I think that will be one way in which you can start to rethink the British question. Because how are we going to defend a kind of sovereign and strategically autonomous Europe? I say this only slightly ironically. The Brits are going to be a part of that. On the eastern frontier, and the EU wants that. Well, where are you going to have the dialogue about what the UK's role alongside others is going to be, isn't going to be? Where are you going to have the dialogue with the UK about defence procurement of complex weapon systems for EU? You're going to have the UK in some of these discussions, even though it isn't a single market or customs union member, and even though it isn't part of a common foreign security policy and doesn't want to be. But there are some conversations in which actually the EU wants the Brits in. There are some conversations where the Brits want to be in, because do we want defence procurement to be done entirely on a EDA type basis within the EU, which closes out opportunities for UK firms? No, I don't think we do. So I think this thing is quite fluid in the light of what's going on in the world at the moment. I do think Macron will be part of kicking off that conversation and saying we need a different debate about the nature of the relationship with the neighbourhood, all elements of the neighbourhood.
Catherine, do you want to come in on that? Does that require, that sounds like it would require massive treaty rewrites, forever and a day renegotiations, and an absolute nightmare of doing everything by unanimity, but maybe not.
I mean, that's absolutely right. And I mean, at the moment, the choice is either skinny or full fat. And the interesting question is, for all of the warm words about Ukraine, the fact is, Ukraine, unfortunately, was one of the most corrupt systems in the world. And, you know, when it comes to actual EU membership, there are going to be large sums of money going in the direction of Ukraine, and there are going to be some hawkish states who will not be happy with that. And so then the question is, do you say to the Ukraine, yes, you can join, or do you put them on the path of membership that's going to take them 50 years and end up looking rather like Turkey, which of course is very disillusioned with its relationship? So then the question is, should actually something more interesting and more creative as some sort of halfway house, but a more meaningful halfway house, be developed? As far as the UK's future relationship with the EU, I mean, in the short term, I think there'll be no change whatsoever. We've already had a question about whether even the TCA would survive, let alone anything slightly full of fat. But the fact is, the UK is in this very unusual position, and don't forget, so is Northern Ireland. And for all of the talk about divergence in the UK and whatever's going to be announced tomorrow about ripping up retained EU law, the fact is that Northern Ireland will be subject to it. And this is always going to keep the UK legally tethered to a certain extent to the EU, whether the UK government likes it or not.
Nicole, do you detect an appetite for this? Is President Macron basically doing what we expect President Macron to do, making a long speech, Sorbonne 2 or whatever, and the rest of the EU shrugs and gets on with it? Or do you think there is a big appetite for a rethink of the future of Europe?
Well, I think, you know, when you look back on how the EU has evolved, right? Sometimes evolution comes through very big shocks. And we've had several of those in the last 5 years, the Ukraine being the latest one. And you've seen how we have kind of moved, I think, in a direction and taken some steps that perhaps might have taken much longer. For example, using the European Peace Facility to send armed assistance to Ukraine. We've put the biggest sanctions package we've ever had together as a result of the invasion of Ukraine. So, you know, and I think you could make an argument that, plus with the publication of the strategic compass as well, it all happened around the same time. I mean, you could make the argument that this crisis has resulted in us stepping up as a security actor within Europe. So I think, as for the future of Europe, I think it's all to play for. The whole purpose of the Conference of Europe was to get the views of citizens, essentially to encourage citizen participation and engagement, and I think it was very, very successful at that. And we'll have to see where it takes us. But I think, as was Ivan who said it, things are so in flux at the moment that I think we have to just see where the chips land after all this. But we've certainly taken a few steps in the last few months that I think no one could have foreseen.
And final question to Olaf. If it was your Secretary of State rather than you here, was sort of saying, actually, by the time of the next election, 2023, 2024, maybe January 2025, what would she like to be able to say about the state of UK-EU relations?
Well, firstly, you'd be getting better gags if she was here. But secondly, you know, functionalism probably not the obvious thing. But I think if you zoom out and you look at where we've got to, and you look ahead to kind of halfway through this decade, the sorts of challenges and need for Western unity will have only increased, and they will also, you'll have a sort of graph of it continuing to increase, right? Because of what's happening in Asia, but also because of where the kind of the challenges around tech, and we haven't really talked about climate change, but climate change as well take you, and because of the other challenges that they will put on our societies, including fiscal. And again, we haven't talked about that, but I think for most of our citizens over the coming year, the cost of living is the thing that's going to, or coming 2 years, the cost of living is the thing that's going to feel very real. And that is including in the face of Russian aggression, is a kind of systemic threat to the democracies in the West. So I think she would say by 2025, the West should have woken up and realized that we're playing a geopolitical game and have given ourselves the tools to win it.
Okay, I'm going to end that there. And thank very much to all of my panelists. So thanks very much, Nicole Mannion, Olaf Henricson-Bell, Catherine Barnard, Hussein Kassim and Ivan Rogers. Do read Hussein's briefings. Look out for loads of commentary on the UK and the Changing Europe website about the local elections, about what is going on in Northern Ireland, where we have some really top commentary coming in from a whole range of Northern Ireland experts, so you can really understand what's going on. And if you enjoyed this conversation, please tell your friends that they can watch it on our YouTube channel. So thank you all very much, and good night, and have a good afternoon, and have a good rest of the day. Thank you all very much.